Welcome to the Tech Trek, where technology leaders share their insights, experiences, and views. Every week I bring you a new guest. And on today's episode...
My name is Harish Parwani. I'm the Vice President of Platform Engineering at CarGurus. CarGurus is the largest destination for buyers and sellers to find used cars in the country. We're traditionally been a marketplace, but now moving into the digital transaction space with things like Sell My Car, come in, which allows you to sell your cars through our site to multiple dealers instead of just going to a single dealer. I run platform engineering here, responsible for all of our developer experience teams, our site reliability teams, database reliability teams, platform as a service, and our core infrastructure teams.
Thank you for being on the show. Super excited to have you. I know we're going to be talking about shared services, something that is kind of core to what you do. I know we're going to cover a few different areas within shared services. I guess just to start off and kind of just establish, things in terms of your team and what shared services means to you in terms of how you guys are using it. That'd probably be a good starting point.
Absolutely. Thanks. And thank you for having me on the show. Just to give a little more context, shared services is another name, and there are a lot of different variations of the name: platform engineering, shared services, developer-facing infrastructure. Back in the days, this used to be called application service providers and other names. So fairly common responsibilities. So you'll hear me use some of those terms synonymously and interchangeably during our call. In terms of shared services responsibilities, I would say at a very high 30,000-foot overview, look at it as teams that will help your core product, focused product development teams go quicker, faster, more secure. And they could be in the form of shared components that they're building. It could be in the form of shared platforms, or could be something very specific around pipelines, infrastructure, how we're going to use the cloud, how do you run on the cloud, etc. So shared services by itself has a very, very wide gamut. I've previously run shared services teams that have focused on front-end platforms to allow folks to develop the micro front-ends quicker, faster, all the way to teams that have focused on Cloud Center of Engineering as a shared platform. So you could run your services on either a single cloud or multiple cloud in a shared services fashion.
I guess we, this episode, we're going to talk about maybe two aspects. One, kind of where to start if you want to establish shared services and kind of, areas of opportunity. And the other is what happens when you yourself are, already, in flight and you might go through an M&A, or you might have to deal with incorporating a different organization and some of the challenges. But I guess let's start at the beginning. Let's say, obviously, CarGurus, you're responsible for shared services. If you don't have shared services, right, you haven't gone to the point in your development maturation as a company where you need it. What are some of the signs where, hey, you know what, shared services could be a good solution to a problem?
If you realize that you're duplicating work, if you realize that your teams are not able to focus on their core competencies. So, for example, if you have a very front-end focused team having to worry about how my front ends are going to be built and deployed and consumed, and updating my infrastructure behind those things. If you're in an area where you're really spending more time and money and not really getting the returns on those the way you would imagine to, probably a good reason is because there's duplication of efforts. You've not looked at consolidating things into a shared services platform. Some other signs are competing stacks, competing technologies, where one part of the business might be super excited about running a Java stack versus another part running a mean stack versus the third part, which swears by Kotlin and everything that's associated with it. I think those are great areas and great signs for any leader to recognize that we've been effective so far, not because we don't have a shared services engineering team, but we've been effective despite not having a shared services engineering team. So I would really go and say that, if you have those problems, yes, you might have been able to move fast in the initial stages of those teams just because you're honing on to what the teams already know. But you'll realize that the speed of change is now decelerating very, very rapidly. And I think that's a real telltale sign of the fact that either we don't have things in a standardized fashion, or we're missing shared services or a platform team that will help consolidate and pick duplications that are happening within the organization, or even inefficiencies that are happening across the organization. And this goes not just on your developer sort of core tooling, frameworks, but sort of also infrastructure tools, platform tools you use, to even things around monitoring and observability. You'll often realize that you're using a different tool set to do same things that you're trying to accomplish in different parts of the company, depending on which team is doing most of the heavy lifting here. So I would say those are the signs that I would keep an eye out on. Obviously, if you've had wider issues around security threats, etc., that's a clear red flag that you haven't invested or haven't looked at shared services or platform teams as the right path to move to.
Very nice. And I guess as you, let's say, see those opportunities and you want to put together your shared services team, what's the impact on the other engineering teams? Obviously, they probably have some inefficiencies. They've taken on some things that they shouldn't have. What happens to the other engineering teams when shared services comes in?
Sure. So there'll be two effects you'll see. You'll either see, hey, thank God, we'll love this, and jubilation, or the counter side to that is, oh my God, why are we doing this, right? What did I do wrong that is defining the need for a shared services engineering team to come in? So I want to make sure, as we're looking at making these changes and introducing a shared services team, you really talk about clarity in sort of roles and responsibilities, because that's going to be very important for the current teams, both because now, instead of working in a nucleus that they've worked in the past, they'll need to sort of closely coordinate and have dependencies on this shared services team. And two is, obviously, you're growing a new team. It's a new way of doing things. There's cultural changes that will come with it. So you got to keep those things in mind as you're setting this up. These are some of the things that sort of, I would say, just be on the lookout for. From a positive perspective, I think it's the inverse of some of the issues that I spoke about earlier. If you've put the right investment in the shared services team, you should see improvements in speed, right? You should see happier developers because now they can focus on the things that they really care and love about, which in most cases is writing, good, high quality code. You should see teams being able to consistently operate, and it's the whole, the build and operate part of your tech stack that you can focus on. And you should be, teams should see that uniformity and take advantage of that. I can keep talking about the benefits. If you are moving people between teams, right now, you're not moving somebody from, A to B without, them having to retrain everything that they do. There's some uniformity around, how you're doing observability, your monitoring tools, your build tools, your DevOps tools, your security tools, etc. So it's a lot easier to move folks between teams as the work changes, as your business goals change, etc., and as you're growing as a company. So definitely a lot of benefits. There's a lot more flexibility into what you can do and what you can, versus what you've been restricted to in the past in terms of your stack, etc. I would say a huge improvement in the quality of the product, because you've got these baseline processes and shared services teams that will help you implement the right tooling around quality. You should absolutely see an improvement in sort of your security posture. I know a lot of companies have requirements to fill from a security perspective if they're dealing with the government or if they're dealing with any private company. I can give you some examples from our side before we pull in any new vendor, right? We make them go through a full security and risk assessment, right? And as part of those risk assessment, some of the best practices define things you've done around quality and security. And the way to achieve them is not by having each individual team work on their own security piece, but having a centralized shared services team that's going to help you achieve and get those protocols in place, which is actually going to help you sell more of your business. So what I'm trying to paint a story here, this is not just an operational efficiency. This is real business value for software companies, tech companies, and even non-tech companies who are looking at selling their services, etc.
I get you mentioned some different what sounds like metrics that you're probably managing or observing. Are there any metrics that you're like, these are some key areas that you have to keep an eye on when it comes to measuring the value of shared services or the impact of shared services?
That's a great question. I wish I had here's the golden rule, and these are the 4 metrics. I think a lot of it will really depend on the type of shared services organization you set up. There's some great documentation out there, but I would definitely encourage folks to please look at the DORA metrics, which is basically, they talk about, looking at your deploy frequency, looking at your change failure rates, looking at things such as MTTI, MTTR, MTTM, your mean times to investigate, resolve, and mitigate your issues, among others. I think those are great metrics. I love change failure rate because that encompasses so many quality aspects in it, which are really, hard to pinpoint down to a single area, but because they encompass a whole gamut of changes that you would have made to achieve, positive impact to your change failure rate. It basically talks about, how good of software releases are you doing, and it all comes through some of these metrics. So absolutely, I would say the DORA metrics. I believe Google was one of the pioneers or put out the original thought leadership on these. Are great metrics to start looking at.
So I guess, a question I did want to ask you, when it comes to shared services, feels like it's a little bit more behind the scenes. They don't ship directly to the customer, maybe have some less visibility in that sense. How do you help bring and celebrate the team wins? Because obviously seems very mission critical, and not seems, it is very mission critical a role.
Great question. And it's a question that I can tell you every single leader in this space struggles with a little bit, but also needs to get creative and smart about how they present the story. And I often have this conversation with my leadership team, my C-level execs, especially folks who are not technical, to help them understand the value of shared services just because they're behind the scene. And I think the best way to do that is sort of to present what if we did not do this scenario, right? So when I take the value of shared services and I want to talk to my CFO and help him explain why we're spending, X number of dollars and number of people we have working on shared services, the way I paint the picture is to help them understand that if it wasn't a single team doing this, you'd probably have to duplicate 75% of this in each and every single team. And there's a real ROI. So let's take some numbers, right? Let's make this a little more concrete. Say you've got 4 dev teams who are working on different parts of product and releases and features. And you put a shared services team in there, say 5 people, right? If you didn't have that shared services team, you'd probably need 3 people in each of those 4 teams, duplicating the work and the efficiency that is required for the business to be successful. So just a very, very brute force math there is, if you didn't have that 5-person shared services team, you'd need 12 employees in those 5 different product teams working on these things in order to gain those same benefits. And I think when you start talking to non-technical leaders, you got to put it in some real numbers to help them understand the ROI behind this. Think of it as you're building a house, and you have 6 different plumbers coming in and 6 different carpenters coming in for each room, because each room has a unique flavor. But you don't do that, right? You bring in a single plumber who does plumbing for the entire house. You bring in a single carpenter who does framing for the entire house. So that's how I think of shared services, as this unifying factor that if you didn't and you had to duplicate it multiple times, you'd be paying a lot more and have a huge differentiation in terms of quality, in terms of expectations and outcomes coming from those. So it all comes down to the ROI. And I think it's a very valid way to look at it, right? If you didn't have that ROI, why would you invest in shared services teams?
Absolutely. That makes sense. I like the examples and the analogies. I think it makes it feel more real as to the how that ROI needs to be viewed and how it's spread across the organization slightly differently than what a tech leader might be thinking. Yeah, I know you mentioned when we were talking before, the other area. Obviously, if you don't have shared services, you walked us through that and some of the challenges, some of the what to watch for, some how to do it. The flip side is when you actually have to go through and bring another company on, whether it's a merger or acquisition. There's various different factors based on where they're at the stage of their development of that organization, and how you actually will view shared services in that environment. So I guess maybe a good starting point would be is, if you're going through a merger or acquisition and you do have a shared services team and you're looking at the other company and you're going to have to start determining their maturity and what where they're at. What are some of the things that you would be starting to do as part of your due diligence of getting ready to build that common shared services across to a new entity?
Sure. Thanks, Amir. I've had the pleasure of being on both sides of this conversation, right? And in my past with companies that are acquiring other companies, as well as being on the other side where one of my previous companies where I was working at was in the process of being acquired. So I've seen the scenario from both sides play out. I think as a acquirer, I definitely value if the company we're looking at has a shared services platform, because now you've got homogeneity to the platform that you're looking at, right? And typically when a company acquires another company, there's multiple layers of integrations they'll look at. They'll generally start at the boundary. So, imagine this: you've got the rings of Saturn. The outermost ring that you want to conquer first is things on the periphery, things like your CDNs, your core infrastructure. Which clouds are you running on? Now, once you've consolidated, or you think this is a great place for us to work together, you then step in to the next ring, which I like to call the shared services engineering ring or the platform engineering ring. Like, do you have a platform that's easily consolidatable? Do you have tools and technologies and processes in place that would go well with the new company or after the companies merge? And those are some of the things that very often companies take for granted, right? But they don't incorporate the fact that moving products between platforms and moving products between tech stacks is extremely hard and expensive. It's doable, but it's probably not a great ROI if you're buying a company and you want to have a quick turnaround there. So I would be very careful when you're doing due diligence. Make sure that it's got, it's my mantra around these things is the 4 Ps. It's got the right people in place. It's got the right process in place. It's got the right product in place, and you've got the right plans to integrate these things. So that's typically how I like to think about these things. But it's really important, because if you don't have a shared services platform, right, your integration costs will be multiple X, because now instead of integrating with one company, you will need to integrate with 3 product teams or 4 different product teams. So your integration cost could be 3x, 4x if you're coming in from an M&A versus a team that has a shared services engineering. And now you know, oh, okay, everything that runs for this company is running on this single platform. So I need to integrate with this platform. So real costs, real outcomes in terms of, is this M&A worth it? Is it, going to give us the cost benefits or the product benefits that we need to, etc.
It sounds like a lot of short-term gain, short-term pain and a lot of long-term benefits because obviously as you're trying to figure out some of these things, it sounds pretty daunting. Like it seems like you have to, pull a lot of strings to figure out all the right areas. But everything you're telling me sounds like it's going to pay off once it's in place and once, whether you're going to stay whatever size, you're going to get acquired, you're going to be an acquirer. There's a host of benefits. So I guess from that standpoint, when you're looking at that short-term component versus the long-term, and you're talking to, business and you're trying to, for your budget and your funding for your team, how do you position that balance?
Great question. And I think that's probably a little bit of a fallacy that we got to make sure we don't fall into, right? The wrong way or the bad way of organizing shared services engineering is if you're going to try to boil the ocean. And very often people fall for that because there's this really nice, shiny end goal 3 years out. And we all know, everybody in the tech industry knows that, multi-year projects like those have very small percentage of success. Right? The success ratios are ridiculously small there. So your goal has to be, what can I gain efficiency on in a quarter? Right? A lot of agile principles also talk about these things, but your goal absolutely has to be, what value add can I provide quarter after quarter? And that's about it. And even if you focus on just the first quarter, I think you'll have success there because you want to iterate slowly on these things, right? You don't want to build a shared services engineering team that will support a 10,000 person organization 5 years down the line if you're a 300 person startup today, right? You're going to invest in the wrong areas. You're going to build for the wrong reasons. So you've got to focus on today's problems. Make small investments. I've seen teams carve out, one individual from, 3 different teams and bring them into a virtual team as a beginning to a shared services organization. And I think that's a fantastic way of doing it. Take baby steps, bring a few people, some thought leaders, some of your key architects who know where the platform's going and what is really needed, and just build upon that. So it doesn't have to be a huge investment. As a matter of fact, I would probably, take a stance and go the other way and tell people, no, if somebody's asking you to make a huge investment upfront and the benefits are going to be, 12, 18 months down the line and nothing before that, you probably should reevaluate what you're doing there. So small steps, look at a quarter. You should absolutely have significant ROIs. As a matter of fact, like when you're early in the process, you've got a lot of low-hanging fruit. So you should be able to get really good benefits right up front by investing in dedicated or even a small virtual shared services team.
I like that a lot. I think the payoff has to be sooner. Otherwise, people lose patience, lose priority. Business changes, and I was going to actually ask you about that. And as the business does change and evolve, and you're watching your shared services team, how are you adjusting your roadmap? How are you keeping up and making sure that you're supporting the growth of the business in the right direction?
There's one certainty, right? I know it's a super cliched term that, change is the only thing that's constant, but listen, the business environment changes, right? Did any of us predict COVID and prepare for that before it hit us? Absolutely not. And doesn't matter which industry you are in, even some of the most conservative industries will have a lot of change. I think the key is to have sort of the right balance in place. And by balance, I mean, yes, you have your longer term goals, but you have to make sure that you're making, what we call one-way decisions very carefully around those, and providing the ability to be nimble around it. I always tell sort of my engineers, right? Let's be nimble, let's be smart, if you can push out a decision to the last responsible moment, that's a great way of doing it. And I think that really pays dividends in a world where your business environment's changing, your requirements will change. And as much as technologists, we would love for our requirements and asks to be standard and non-moving, the reality is, there's a higher chance they're going to change on you than not. So, staying nimble, and again, just small increments, right? Don't aim for the moon. If you're going to build a spaceship, right, do it in bits and pieces. So if you can adjust and adapt, and I can go on a whole thing about sort of being agile and using agile methodologies, but I think that will take us from where we are. But it's true, right? I really vouch for that. Small incremental changes, get good constant feedback from your users. And one of a really interesting trend that has come about in the last couple of years in shared services and platform engineering has been heavy investment into technical product managers, right? So somebody who can be the voice of the business, the voice of your customer, be it internal customer, to help you refine what you need, when you need, where your priorities are. And this is something that has not existed for many, many years. Back in the days, shared services engineering team were like, yeah, this is not an external customer-facing team. You don't need product managers here. But that mindset has changed. And I've really seen that change in the last couple of years only. And it's paid fantastic dividends. So I would say if you have the ability to invest in a technical product manager to support your shared services engineering team, you're increasing the chance of success drastically for your team.
I think that's fantastic. I was going to ask you. Obviously, you've been doing this for a while. Technology is evolving; it's changing. Over the last, let's say, 2-5 years, however long back, have you seen some distinct shifts? Have you seen some changes to how you should view shared services based on your learned experiences, and I guess how technology is iterating and shifting as well?
Yeah, I would say. The biggest change has been around cloud and cloud adoption. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of the impact that has had, right? I would say shared services has gone from being a purely cost center to a business accelerator. And I can give you examples. We have teams internally that are looking at using AWS services that are going to help us deliver products and deliver new products to our customers. So this is absolutely a business distinction, something that we never thought about years ago when everything was, on-prem infrastructure. That's something that I'm super excited about, because now I can pitch to my stakeholders that, hey, this is not just a cost investment around productivity and security and speed and flexibility, but this could also be a business differentiator that will allow you to deliver customers features that you wouldn't have been able to in the past. And yeah, I think by far that's been sort of the biggest, macro level change in how we're viewing, shared services and platform engineering across the board.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I think the business accelerator component you mentioned, and we were talking about ROI. You're talking about short win, short-term wins, and keep the quarter by quarter view moving. It's interesting because how mission critical the cloud is, and what sits on shared services to me seems distinctly mission critical, and it almost seems that anything that's being viewed on the roadmap should be dotted line back to shared services to make sure it's going to be ready. It's going to have the ability to manage, support all those different components, because building the X widget now is only a small part of the process.
It absolutely is. And I think we often make mistakes in realizing, how big of these dependencies are, how important they are, and how they could make the difference between, releasing a product in a short order versus it being a, multi-quarter effort. And that's something I think business leaders have now started accepting and realizing is the reality of things. So just investing in those teams, investing in the right processes, making sure you're from a cultural perspective, you've built in the right gates and expectations is equally important in those terms.
Harish, awesome, man. I appreciate you being on the show, sharing your views, your experiences. I think it's been fantastic. I'd like to wrap up by asking each guest if they could ask the next guest to cover a topic for them or cover a question that they may have. What would you like to hear more about?
Sure, absolutely. I would love to hear from fellow technologists, fellow leaders around diversity and sort of how do they make conscious efforts in an industry like ours, which is very heavily, I would say, it's very non-diverse. So there's a lot of traditionally marginalized groups that we could do more work with in terms of getting better representation into our teams. And I would say shared services is probably a bigger culprit in the subsector of engineering and technical teams. So I would love for a future guest to come talk about that.
Awesome. That's a great topic because I think we always need to be making sure we're covering that. What's a good way of getting a hold of if somebody wants to, just reach out, pick your brain on anything you've mentioned on the podcast? What's a good way of doing that?
Absolutely. So I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, Harish Parwani, Harish Parwani. Please feel free to reach out. Just drop in a line saying you heard me talk at the podcast, and I'll be more than happy to connect with you. My email's my first name, last name at Gmail. But definitely LinkedIn, I would say, is a better place. And I look forward to chatting with whoever reaches out.
Awesome, man. Thanks again for being on the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Amir.